Hi, everybody. Welcome back to See On Live here on NRA TV. I'm Bill Whittle sitting in for Colion Noir. I'll be back on Wednesday, tomorrow, I think. And we're having a lively discussion about all kinds of high level things that influence our ability to use firearms, buy firearms, and all the rest of it. It's not as much fun as putting a couple rounds downrange, but sometimes it's a little more important. Our next guest joins us from a website that I've been familiar with for a very long time. Sonja Bochow is with us from Right Wing News. Sonja, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I am.
Sonja, I remember back when I started writing for a blog called Eject, Eject, Eject back in 2003 or 4, and I remember when John Hawkins started Right Wing News, and everything back then was very simple and very small, but you guys have just grown into an absolute powerhouse on the web, and it's been fun to watch. You guys are pretty busy over there, aren't you?
We really are. Yes, we are. We're trying to get those news stories out in a real-time manner, and we are relevant to what's going on out there in politics and with the Second Amendment, as well as many other conservative issues. Yes.
Okay, before we get back to the Second Amendment, because you did a story about docs and Glocks that I want to talk about very much, let's just for a second talk about what you're doing, what NRA TV is doing, and so on. This whole idea of citizen journalism is pretty new, really, isn't it? But we all, pretty much everybody with a cell phone now, is walking around the country with a high definition television camera in their pocket. And I remember seeing Hillary Clinton stumbling into the limousine after the 9/11 memorial service last fall. And I wouldn't have known that had happened if it hadn't been for two citizens with cell phones who just decided to upload this stuff. The idea that news could be sent directly to the web without going through the filters of CNN's editorial board is kind of exciting, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's very exciting, and I think we've really seen that come to fruition with this last election, where we have a president now who goes straight to the people via Twitter rather than having to have his words filtered by whatever media source and whatever they think that they want to say about what he's saying. The people get to hear exactly what he's thinking and saying.
Yeah, it's almost like an island hopping campaign for Donald Trump. He's not going to fight the press head on. He's just going to outflank them. He's just going to pretend they're not there. And of all the things the mainstream media can't stand, Sonja, we both know the idea that they're irrelevant terrifies them and scares just the living daylights out of those people. That's why I think you're just starting to see signs of hysteria, don't you think, on the part of the mainstream media with the election of Donald Trump? I mean, these people are losing their minds.
They absolutely are. And I hear the word unhinged used a lot. I would agree with that characterization in many ways. It just seems that the idea that their candidate lost and lost fair and square is not one that they can really handle on some level. And so everything and everyone is to blame instead of the fact that they fielded a candidate that the American people simply didn't choose. And so, yes, they are acting in ways that are really pretty out there at this point. We see that now with this whole Russians hacking the election
Mm-hmm.
nonsense that we hear out there. And it really is, it's something to see, because I really haven't seen in my lifetime a president who is able to handle the press in as deft a manner as President Trump does.
That's exactly right. The left, the reason the left can't accept the election, Sonia, in my mind anyway, is that their entire philosophy of modern progressivism is that we're smarter than the people out there in flyover country, and we're better too. We're more moral. So the idea that the American people would reject their ideas and their principles and their policies is just something they can't conceive of. Had to be something. It was the Russians, or it was fake news, or it was the FBI. As long as it's something other than themselves, and that lack of introspection is going to cost them, I think. But let's talk about one of the stories that you did called "Docs and Glocks." It's like a catchy headline. You want to just give us the basics on that?
Sure. Bill, when I wrote this story, uh, a decision had been handed down from the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, located in Atlanta, of course. They take cases that originate in Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. And what they do is, of course, they make their decision. This particular case had sort of worked its way up through the lower courts, and it came out of Florida. And it was centered around the idea that a physician would ask you during an examination or while you were there for some reason related to your health, that your physician would be able to ask you, are there any firearms in the house? Well, I am
There's
a
an answer
mother
for that.
of four. Sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just have to answer that question as if I was asked that question, and the answer is that's none of your business. None of your business. I'm sorry to interrupt you like that. The idea that a doctor would ask you about firearms in the house is enough to make me absolutely lose my mind. It has got nothing to do with them whatsoever.
Right. I agree with that. And the premise that I put forth in the article is this. The judges made their decision and they defended it by saying that a doctor has a First Amendment right to ask a patient this question, and that if we say they can't, we're infringing on that right to speak freely. And then secondarily, they said that because the patient does have the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, that because the doctor is not an authority of any kind, that in essence, they can ask the question, but they can't do anything like come take away your firearms or remove your guns from your home. But the problem with that argument is that it is not a First Amendment argument. It is
Of
also
course not.
not a Second Amendment argument. The argument here is a privacy argument. As you just
Yes.
said, absolutely none of my doctor's business whether or not I own firearms, and I absolutely will not answer the question, even if the court says they have the First Amendment right to ask it.
Yeah, this idea that a doctor has a First Amendment right to ask about anything he wants to. He's not going to be asking you about what you thought, of the Tin Woodman's performance in The Wizard of Oz. It's this idea that he can just say anything and you're infringing on his right to free speech by saying you can't ask people about whether they have guns in their house, just nonsense. And furthermore, it was part of Obamacare was the idea that we would find out look, they can't get the information elsewhere, right? Or at least we don't think they can. So now they're going to basically say, well, since we control your health care, and since your daughter is in there with an emergency room or something, and she's got some kind of a kidney problem or something like that, and since her life is in our hands now, before we do the operation, by the way, Mr. Johnson, do you have any handguns in your house? Any weapons? And if so, what kind? And where do you think they might be kept? It's so
Yeah,
transparent to me, Sonja.
absolutely. And as I have said actually many times in personal conversations, there's really only a couple of reasons for a doctor to ask that question. The first one is the least offensive, and that would be that they themselves do not agree with the Second Amendment, and this is their sort of obtuse way of lecturing a patient about having guns in the home. The second and far more devious reason for asking the question is, and I'm sure that you can concur that when you're at a doctor's office, when I'm at a doctor's office and they're asking me questions, everything I say is getting typed into a computer. Well, that is a
Hmm.
database. And we do not need to have databases of who owns firearms and where they are located, because that, in the
Exactly.
wrong hands, have absolutely dire consequences.
And since the implementation of Obamacare, which is basically, doubled or tripled rates, people, you need an insurance policy to cover your deductible on your health insurance policy, or is $7,000 deductibles and all this stuff. Point I'm making is this: as these economic regulations impact individual physicians more and more, in order to maintain their standard of living, because they do so much of their time and so much of their money goes to dealing with federal regulations, they have to see more patients. And I think anybody who's been to a doctor that's part of a healthcare plan recently would tell you you don't even have the time to ask about all the things you want to ask regarding our health. The idea that this guy would just start spinning a yarn about what kind of guns do you have because Dr. Ben Casey's got all the time in the world, just here sit on my knee and relax while we wait for our next patient in 45 minutes. It just doesn't happen. It's just plain a lie. It's an absolute lie.
Yeah, it is an absolute lie. And as a mother of four, there were several years ago when I would take my children to the pediatrician, invariably they would ask that question of my children. And being caught off guard, my children answered the question, but the time came when I said, we're not answering that question anymore. And then they stopped asking the question for a while, which I can only assume this is probably when the original case was brought against this question being asked. And so the pediatricians, at least, backed off of it for a while.
Hmm. Sonia, we're going to go to a break. We'll be back in a few minutes. Just to close this idea out, I talked to a person who was in command of a group of Green Berets, and his executive officer, rather his superior officer, had said, "You now, it's policy for you to go and ask the men in your company what kind of weapons they have and where they're kept." And he said, "Sir, I refuse to obey that order." And his CO said, "Okay, let's just say that you did." It just takes individual strength like that. We'll be right back after the break. This is CN Live on NRA TV.